In this month's video, I'd like to talk about the affidavit of support and the concept of a household size. Hi everyone, my name is Paul Wayburne and I am an immigration attorney. In this month's video, I'd like to talk about the affidavit of support and the concept of a household size. The conventional wisdom, and to some extent the law, permits a US citizen to petition for the immigration of their immediate relative. And that would include a spouse, an unmarried child under the age of 21, and a parent. For the purposes of this video, we're not going to discuss preference categories. In other words, spouses and children of permanent residents and other such preference categories. We're only going to deal with immediate relatives of US citizens. Even though a US citizen can petition for the immigration of their immediate relative, they have to be able to sponsor the relative, meaning they need to have the financial resources required to support the relative financially. So if you're a US citizen and you're poor and you don't have any family, it would be very difficult to successfully bring about the immigration of your relative. And there are ways around this, which we will discuss. But for the purposes of this video, we're only going to talk about the household size. So if you Google HHS space USCIS poverty guidelines, which is the Health and Human Services and United States Citizenship and Immigration Services guidelines, you will see three columns as to what a sponsor is required to earn in order to sponsor their relative. So you have three columns. In the first column, you'll have the sponsor's household size. The second column, you'd have what are the HHS poverty guidelines. And then the third column is 125% of the HHS poverty guidelines. Now, most people are not members of the US Armed Forces. A member of the US Armed Forces just needs to earn 100% of the Health and Human Services poverty guideline. But for everybody else who is not a member of the armed forces, they have to earn 125% of the poverty guidelines based on the sponsor's household size. So a sponsor with a household of 2 would have to earn $25,550. A sponsor with a household of 3 would have to earn $32,275, etc., etc., etc. A person who has a household of 8 is required to earn $65,900 with $6,725 extra for each additional person. So there is some objectivity as to the amount that must be earned per member of the household size. The difficulty that clients have and people who are preparing the forms on their own have is that you or somebody else might have no idea how to calculate the household size. So let's turn to the affidavit of support. You can Google I-864 affidavit of support and then go to the form, and you'll find on page 4 several blocks that are listed under each other concerning the sponsor's household size. If you read there, it says, persons you are sponsoring in this affidavit, provide the number you entered in part 3. So let's just take a typical example of a husband or a spouse sponsoring a spouse, a US citizen spouse sponsoring a foreign spouse. So then you're sponsoring one person. So all you would need to fill in is on item number 1, you would put in 1. Okay, because that's the person you're sponsoring in this affidavit. And then for persons not sponsored in this affidavit, regarding item number 2, which says yourself, you put 1, you're only one person. And then in item number 3, it says if you are currently married, enter 1 for your spouse, and you don't actually enter 1 for your spouse because you've already counted your spouse in item number 1, so you put not applicable. And in our case, where there's a household of 2, you would put the rest would be not applicable or 0. And there at the bottom, just underneath 8, you would put household size 2. And now we'll explain several other scenarios. So in this example, where a US citizen spouse is sponsoring just their foreign citizen spouse, there would just be two members of the household, and then the sponsor would be required to earn $25,550. But this becomes more complicated if there is a bigger family. So if you look at item number 3, it says, if you are currently married, enter one for your spouse. Importantly, if you've already counted your spouse as the person you're sponsoring in the affidavit, you don't need to count the spouse again. But this brings up another issue. What happens, let's say a US citizen is sponsoring a parent and they're married to their estranged spouse, they haven't gotten a divorce, and their estranged spouse is still alive. What happens then? Even though the estranged spouse does not live with the sponsor, and the sponsor doesn't pay anything towards the estranged spouse, for all we know, the spouse lives in some faraway overseas place, you have to count the spouse as part of the household size. So if a US citizen is sponsoring the parent, so then the US citizen still needs to count the estranged spouse as part of the household size. What about dependent children? So the rule is a child who has not reached the age of majority in the jurisdiction in where the child lives, or is otherwise not emancipated, in other words, a court declaring that the parent is no longer responsible for the child, unless that is the case, a child must be counted as part of the household size. Usually, a US citizen parent would claim deductions in their tax return concerning the child, and then definitely that child would have to be counted as a dependent. But even if the US citizen parent does not count a minor, or does not list a minor child as a dependent on the latest US federal tax return, that child is still considered part of the household size. So if you look at the instructions to the I-864, and it says they add together the number of persons for whom you are financially responsible. Some of these persons may not be residing with you, and that would include a minor child who is not claimed on the federal tax return and who doesn't live with you. Perhaps the US citizen doesn't even contribute money towards the maintenance of that child. So it's really important to speak to an attorney to ask who must be counted and who must not be counted. If you look at item number 5 on page 4 of the Affidavit of Support, if you have any other dependents, so you could have people that you are financially responsible for, do not claim on your US tax return. So let's say an elderly parent, perhaps they don't live with you, you have to count them as part of your household size. What about people you've sponsored on prior occasions? They would also form part of the household size. So if you have a parent that you sponsored that's looking after themselves and they haven't become a US citizen, and so they would also need to be part of the household size, even if you're not contributing anything to their maintenance, because that person is part of the household, because you've already filed an affidavit of support on their behalf. The next category is quite interesting. So let's make it a household of 3. Let's say that the US citizen lives with their US citizen or permanent resident adult child. The US citizen earns $25,000 and the adult child lives with the US citizen, and the US citizen wants to sponsor another foreign spouse, presumably not the adult child's parent. So let's say the US citizen earns $25,000 and the adult child, let's say, earns $10,000 a year. So then that adult child can be considered as part of the household of the US citizen sponsor, and then the adult child can become a household member, and then in that way one can add the income of the adult child to the income of the US citizen sponsor, and in that way the sponsor would cross the threshold. Now, what happens if the US citizen sponsor does not cross the required income as per the household size. So then in that case, the US citizen sponsor needs to find a joint sponsor. And then with the joint sponsor, you would run the same calculations with their household size. So let's say there's 4 people in the joint sponsor's household, but one would need to include the spouse of the US citizen who is being sponsored in that household size. Sometimes it's really not clear who or should not be counted, and the situation can be somewhat ambiguous. Sometimes it could be that the sponsor cannot find a joint sponsor, and there might be nuances that can be prevailed upon in order to assess whether such a person should be considered part of the household size. If a person has a lot of money, my bias is just to be generous with the household size, and if there's an ambiguity, so then you include it. The ambiguous household member in the household size. Sometimes that is not, sometimes it finds it difficult to find a joint sponsor, or there is no possible joint sponsor. And then it's important to speak to an attorney, because there might be ways to exclude people from the household size who should be excluded from their household size. But this is a sort of a legal determination. So the concept of household is really, really ambiguous. And so, because sometimes people are just not part of the household, yet they should be included. Sometimes people are part of the household, but they should be excluded. So always very important to contact an attorney to prepare your immigration papers, because the average person cannot do this themselves. And an attorney would often devote tremendous time, energy, and attention to whether to include or exclude people from the household size. So please speak to us and we'll be able to help you. Thank you very much.